If you pulled up California's official earthquake hazard map 10 years ago and compared it side by side with the one government agencies are using right now, entire neighborhoods have changed color. Not because the ground moved, not because a new fault tore open overnight, because scientists just got a far clearer picture of a threat that was sitting there the whole time. And in some of the most densely populated parts of the state, that clearer picture is worse than what anyone was working with before. Nearly 500 faults that were not on the map a decade ago are on it now. Entire neighborhoods in the East Bay just had their shaking risk increased by up to 25% in a single update. And in the hills above Los Angeles and along the San Mateo coastline, new legal earthquake zones were drawn this past November, redrawing which properties are required by law to prove they're not sitting directly on top of an active fault before anyone can build on them. So the real question isn't whether the map changed. It obviously did. The real question is what that change actually means, whether it means the big one is genuinely creeping closer, or whether it just means we're finally seeing the danger that was always there with better eyes. Today, we're breaking that down properly. What actually changed on these maps, why it changed, and what the honest, non-sensational answer is to the question everyone in California is quietly asking themselves. No exaggeration, straight from USGS's own published research and the California Geological Survey's own release notes. If you want to stay ahead of every update like this one, get subscribed and turn on notifications right now. Let's get into it. Let's start with the biggest single change, because it reshaped the entire national picture, not just California's. In 2023, the United States Geological Survey released a fully updated national seismic hazard model, the master scientific framework that estimates how likely damaging earthquake shaking is anywhere in the country over the coming decades. This was the first time in the model's history that all 50 states were updated simultaneously, built from a massive, multi-year collaborative effort pulling in data from more than 130,000 cataloged seismic events across the country. And buried inside that update was a number that genuinely surprised even people who follow this field closely. New tools, better instruments, and improved computer modeling techniques allowed researchers to identify nearly 500 additional faults capable of producing a damaging earthquake that simply were not accounted for in the previous version of the model, pushing the total number of mapped fault sources across the country to roughly 1,000. Mark Peterson, the USGS geophysicist who led the study, described it as one of the largest collaborative scientific efforts of its kind, pulling together federal agencies, state governments, and private engineering firms into a single unified assessment. Here's what that actually means in plain terms. It does not mean 500 brand new cracks suddenly opened up in the earth between the old map and the new one. These faults were always there, buried, some of them barely visible at the surface, some of them only detectable through subtle patterns in GPS ground movement data, or LiDAR laser scans capable of revealing tiny geological offsets hidden under vegetation and soil that older mapping techniques simply could not resolve. What changed is our ability to see them. Think of it like upgrading from an old blurry telescope to a modern one. The stars you're looking at didn't move. You're just finally seeing detail that was invisible before. That distinction matters enormously for how you interpret everything else in this video, because a map showing more danger is not automatically a map showing a more dangerous planet. Sometimes it's simply a map showing a more honest one. That said, some of what showed up in this update genuinely does represent new information about how dangerous specific places actually are, not just better cataloging of what's already known to exist. Under the new model, seismic hazard came back highest in California, southern Alaska, and Hawaii, with some regions of California now sitting at a 95% probability or greater of experiencing damaging earthquake shaking sometime within the next 100 years. Read that number again. Not a chance of an earthquake happening somewhere in the state. A 95% chance of damaging shaking, specifically in certain zones within a single century, which in the context of a human lifetime is close enough to a certainty to plan around directly. And nationally, the updated model found that nearly 75% of the entire United States could experience potentially damaging earthquake shaking at some point over the next 100 years. A genuinely striking finding that pushed seismic risk conversations into parts of the country that rarely think about earthquakes at all, from bridges in New York and Atlanta to infrastructure corridors through St. Louis and the New Madrid seismic zone along the Mississippi River. California's earthquake threat isn't new, but this update placed it inside a much larger, much more comprehensive national context than any previous version of the map had. Now let's zoom into the part of this story that hits closest to home for millions of actual Californians, because a separate, more localized update focused specifically on the San Francisco Bay Area delivered a genuinely uncomfortable finding. USGS released a refined hazard map showing significantly increased earthquake risk across parts of the East Bay and San Jose, driven by something most residents in those areas had never heard of before this research came out: deep sedimentary basins sitting directly underneath their communities. Here's the geology in plain terms. Solid bedrock transmits seismic shaking relatively efficiently and predictably, but large pockets of softer, looser sediment, built up over millions of years in low-lying valleys and basins, behave very differently when a seismic wave passes through them. They trap and amplify the slower, longer period waves an earthquake produces, essentially acting like a bowl of gelatin being shaken rather than a solid block of concrete, extending the duration of shaking and increasing its intensity well beyond what the earthquake's magnitude alone would suggest at the surface. Cities like Concord, Walnut Creek, and San Jose sit directly on top of basins like this, and the updated USGS model increased shaking intensity estimates in these areas by up to 25% compared to the previous version released just 5 years earlier. That is not a minor statistical adjustment. A 25% increase in expected shaking intensity is the kind of number that changes how engineers design a new building, and it's specifically tall buildings and long bridges, the structures most sensitive to those slow, rolling basin-amplified waves, that USGS flagged as facing the greatest elevated risk under the new numbers. It's worth being direct about what this means for anyone actually living in those communities right now. Current building codes across California do not yet incorporate these updated calculations. They simply hadn't been finalized when most existing structures were designed and built. USGS has been explicit that this new data is intended to form the foundation for future building code revisions, not an immediate retroactive requirement forcing anyone to retrofit their home tomorrow. But it does mean that new construction going forward in any future building code updates adopted by California's state and local governments will need to account for a genuinely higher level of shaking intensity in these specific basin communities than anyone was designing for as recently as 5 years ago. If you own property in Concord, Walnut Creek, San Jose, or similar basin communities across the Bay Area, this is exactly the kind of update worth understanding, because it directly affects how your home and the buildings around you are likely to perform the next time a major earthquake strikes the region. There's a second, more legally consequential kind of map change happening right now too, and this one moved even more recently. Just this past November, the California Geological Survey released a fresh batch of official Alquist-Priolo earthquake fault zone maps, the specific regulatory boundaries that determine where builders and property owners are legally required to investigate for active fault traces before any new construction can proceed. This isn't an abstract scientific hazard estimate, it's a hard legal line on a map drawn in direct response to the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, which ruptured directly beneath existing buildings and exposed a gap in California's construction regulations that state lawmakers moved quickly to close. The new maps released this past November cover new and revised fault zones tied to the Sierra Madre fault zone, running through the foothill communities of Arcadia, Glendale, La Cañada Flint Ridge, Monrovia, Pasadena, and Sierra Madre in Los Angeles County, along with the San Gregorio fault zone, affecting Half Moon Bay and portions of San Mateo and Santa Cruz counties along the coast. If you own property, or you're considering buying property, in any of these specific communities, this update is not hypothetical. It's an immediate, practical change to what due diligence is legally required before a permit gets approved for new construction on that land. So when you put all three of these updates together, the national scale addition of nearly 500 newly identified faults, the Bay Area's basin-driven 25% jump in expected shaking intensity, and the fresh legal fault zone boundaries drawn across Los Angeles and San Mateo counties just months ago, you start to see why California's earthquake map genuinely does look meaningfully different today than it did even 5 or 10 years ago. But none of what we've covered so far actually answers the question in the title. Is the big one getting closer? For that, we need to talk about something separate from mapping technology entirely, actual measured changes in the physical stress sitting inside California's fault systems right now. This is where the science gets genuinely more unsettling, because unlike the mapping updates, which mostly reflect improved observation rather than a changing planet, this next piece of research is measuring something that has actually physically changed underground. Earlier this year, a research team led by Dr. Lilian Burkhardt at the University of Bern in Switzerland published findings in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth, built around an enormous physics-based computer model simulating 1,000 years of earthquake history along the southern San Andreas Fault and its neighboring San Jacinto Fault system. Feeding the model with radiocarbon-dated sediment records, tree ring evidence, and centuries of historical observation, the team calculated present-day stress levels along both fault systems, and their conclusion was about as direct as scientific findings get. Stress along multiple segments of the southern San Andreas fault system is now sitting at or above the highest levels recorded anywhere in that 1,000-year simulation, not approaching a critical threshold. According to this model, already past it, here's why that stress has been building for so long without releasing. The southern San Andreas Fault last ruptured in a major event back in 1857, the Fort Tejon earthquake, estimated at magnitude 7.9. That was well over a century and a half ago. For all that time, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate have continued grinding past each other along this fault at a steady rate of roughly 5 centimeters a year, and because the fault has stayed locked rather than slipping, none of that accumulated motion has been released. It's simply been stored as elastic stress, squeezing and bending the surrounding rock tighter and tighter with every passing year. The Burkhardt team's research adds a second genuinely alarming layer to this picture. They identified a specific geographic junction called Cajun Pass, roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles, where the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems physically meet. And their modeling suggests this junction can behave as what they're calling an earthquake gate, a point where a rupture beginning on one fault can potentially jump onto the other under the right stress conditions, turning what would otherwise have been a single fault earthquake into a combined multi-fault rupture. According to their modeling, a joint rupture crossing Cajun Pass could produce an earthquake somewhere between magnitude 7.4 and 7.8, a rupture large enough to simultaneously threaten the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley all at once, rather than a single, more contained corridor along one fault line. Right now, according to the study, stress levels on both fault systems are running close enough to each other and elevated enough overall that researchers describe this earthquake gate as effectively unlocked, meaning the physical conditions required for that kind of combined rupture are currently in place. Kate Scherer, a USGS geologist and co-author on the study, put the underlying reason plainly: it has simply been such a long time since either fault system produced a major earthquake that the accumulated stress has grown enormous. And when USC seismologist Ahmed El-Banna was asked directly when the next big event along this system might actually arrive, his answer captured exactly why this kind of research resists easy headlines. It could be today, tomorrow, in 10 years, or in 30 years, because on a geological timescale, there is genuinely no meaningful difference between those options. That's the honest, uncomfortable core of earthquake science that every legitimate seismologist will tell you directly. We can measure accumulated stress, we can calculate long-term probabilities, and we can identify which fault segments are overdue relative to their historical average, but we cannot currently predict the specific day, month, or even decade a fault like this will actually rupture. So let's actually answer the question properly, because it deserves a real answer rather than either blind reassurance or manufactured panic. Is the big one getting closer? In the sense that matters scientifically, yes, in the most literal, measurable way possible. Every single year that passes without the southern San Andreas fault rupturing is another year of stress accumulating on a fault system that stress modeling now shows is already sitting at its highest measured level in 1,000 years. That part of the story is not about improved mapping technology revealing something that was always equally likely. It's about actual physical stress inside the Earth's crust continuing to build in real time, exactly the way a spring gets wound tighter the longer it goes without being released. But in the sense that matters for your day-to-day life, the answer is more nuanced, because being closer to an inevitable event in geological terms, which operate across centuries and millennia, is a completely different thing from that event being imminent in human terms, which operate across days and years. A fault that's overdue by 20 years and a fault that's overdue by 170 years can both be described as stressed, elevated risk, and scientifically concerning, while still giving zero specific actionable warning about whether the rupture happens this afternoon or 3 decades from now. What the updated maps and the updated stress research actually give us together is something genuinely valuable, even without a specific date attached to it. They tell engineers exactly which buildings and bridges need the most urgent seismic retrofitting attention. They tell city planners exactly which zones require the strictest new construction standards. They tell property buyers and owners exactly which parcels of land now carry a legal fault investigation requirement that didn't exist a year ago. And they tell emergency planners exactly which regions, from the sediment-amplified basins of the East Bay to the Cajun Pass Junction northeast of Los Angeles, deserve the most focused resource allocation for earthquake preparedness funding. None of that requires predicting the exact date of the next major earthquake, because building codes, retrofitting programs, and emergency response planning all operate on the same timescale the stress itself does, decades, not days. If there's a genuinely important practical takeaway buried in all of this technical detail, it's that California's evolving earthquake maps are not primarily a warning that something catastrophic is about to happen next week. They are a tool, arguably one of the most sophisticated natural hazard tools any government agency maintains anywhere in the world, designed to make sure that when the ground finally does move the way it moved in 1857, or the way it's clearly capable of moving through a combined rupture across Cajun Pass, the buildings, bridges, and communities sitting above it are as ready as engineering and public policy can realistically make them. California already leads the country in seismic building codes, in early warning technology through the Shake Alert system, and in public earthquake education compared to almost anywhere else in the United States. These new maps are simply the latest input into that ongoing, decades-long process of closing the gap between what scientists know about the risk and what actually gets built, retrofitted, and prepared for on the ground. For anyone living in California right now, especially in the specific communities we've talked about today, the East Bay Basin cities, the Los Angeles foothill communities along the newly mapped Sierra Madre fault zone, the San Mateo coastline near the San Gregorio fault, or anywhere within reach of a Cajon Pass rupture scenario, the practical response doesn't actually change much regardless of exactly how close the big one turns out to be. Know whether your specific property sits inside a newly designated Alquist-Priolo fault zone, information that's publicly available through the state's own mapping tools. If you're in an older building, especially an older soft-story apartment structure common across California from the 1960s and 70s, understand whether it's been seismically retrofitted, and if you're a renter, it's entirely reasonable to ask your landlord directly. Secure heavy furniture, water heaters, and anything mounted on a wall that could fall during strong shaking. Keep at least 72 hours of emergency, water, food, and medical supplies on hand for every member of your household. And make sure your phone has Shake Alert enabled, since even a few seconds of advance warning before major shaking arrives can be the difference between finding cover and being caught standing in the open when it hits. The honest, unglamorous truth about California's earthquake risk is the same one this state's own scientists have been repeating for decades. We cannot tell you when, but we can tell you with increasing precision every time one of these maps gets updated, where the danger is concentrated and how severe it's likely to be when it finally arrives. That's not a reason for panic. It's exactly the kind of information a well-prepared state is supposed to have, and California, whatever its shortcomings elsewhere, remains genuinely ahead of almost everywhere else in the country in actually using it. We'll be tracking every future update to these hazard maps, along with any new developments in the Cajon Pass stress research, right here on this channel. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment and tell us if you just found out your neighborhood sits inside one of these newly updated zones. And if this finally explained what all these hazard map headlines actually mean in plain English, hit like and share it with someone in California who needs to see it. Stay prepared, and we'll see you in the next one.